All right, so welcome everyone to Igniting the Future of Community Foundations. This is our third webinar in our series on amplifying community voice. My name is Melody McLean. I am the Director of Communications at CF Leads, and I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items to get us started. So first of all, this is a traditional webinar, meaning you can hear us, but we can't hear you. However, we do want to hear from you, so we invite you to leave any comments you have, links, feedback, in the chat box, which you can find in your Zoom toolbar. And just to note that your webinar chat might have been defaulted to send only to panelists, which are the people that you'll see on your screen. If you want to send your chat message to everyone on the webinar, just use this drop down to change the to field from all panelists to all panelists and all attendees, and it will go to everyone. If you have any questions during today's webinar, you can post them in the Q&A box, which is also in your Zoom toolbar, and we'll be monitoring both of those boxes throughout the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website in the resources section and on the Going All In portal, and you can find our first two webinar recordings there as well. And if we have any technical issues and Zoom stops working, we will switch to phone. The number is here on your screen, and we will email everyone if we do have to switch to phone. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our board chair, Ellen Gilligan, to give us a welcome.
Well, thank you, Melody, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on your time zone, and welcome to the CF Leads webinar on Community Foundations Amplifying Community Voice. This is the third in a series of four webinars, and I hope you're able to join the first, and you'll be able to join the one next week. I'm Ellen Gilligan, President and CEO of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation and Chair of the Board of CF Leads. And I appreciate that so many of you, nearly 200 in all, have been able to carve out time in your busy schedules to join us today for this third in a series of webinars on our new portal, Going All In, which documents Community Foundation's commitment and momentum in assuming greater community leadership. As I mentioned at the outset of our first webinars, this has been a turbulent and challenging year on so many fronts, from the devastating pandemic and its dire economic consequences to the national reckoning on race, to now the horrific fires in the West, providing sobering evidence of our climate crisis. And community foundations across the country have been deeply involved in addressing all of these issues. I also disclaim that we don't purport to suggest that local philanthropy can solve all of our problems, but my colleagues and I are so excited to be here today to share the findings of our new research showing that community foundations are playing their part and are poised to do so much more. Next slide, please. As many of you know, CF Leads is a national network of community foundations working together to build strong communities. Each year, CF Leads works with hundreds of CEOs, board members, and senior staff, striving to strengthen their community foundations' leadership muscle, who are eager to go all in, from being good grant makers to becoming powerful local change makers. Formed a dozen years ago, CF Leads is the only philanthropy-serving organization exclusively dedicated to community foundations and their community leadership. We build organizational capacity, share knowledge, and galvanize the sector around the key issues of our time. Last year, Deborah Elwood, President and CEO of CF Leads, took stock of her 10 years at the helm of the organization, shared her observations, and promised to get a better sense of where the community foundation field is and where it's headed. And this project is a result of that commitment. Next slide, please. And as I've shared in earlier webinars, I was pleased to share an august group of 15 community foundation presidents from across the country who advised this important effort. I'm thrilled that 3 of my colleagues who served on that committee Ivy Allen, President of the Foundation for the Mid-South, Shelley O'Quinn, CEO, Inovia Foundation, and Pedro Ramos, President and CEO of the Philadelphia Foundation, are able to join us today as we explore the ways in which community foundations are amplifying community voice. And before I turn the program over to Deborah, I want to just briefly say a word of thanks and acknowledgement to the CF Leads team and Jim Rooney, our project director, as well as our colleagues who served on the advisory committee, all who helped envision, shape, and advise this important work. I'd now like to turn the program over to Deborah to share the areas of momentum that we've identified and which we believe provide pathways for our collective success. Deborah?
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your leadership on this project as chair of the advisory committee, which, as you noted, met 6 times. So and I'm really grateful for the active engagement of the whole advisory committee, who really gave this work a lot of perspective because community foundations, they were from community foundations from across the country that serve big urban areas, mid-sized regions, rural communities. And I'm really grateful to the advisory committee for really helping us to make sense of the field-wide survey that we issued and of the dozens and dozens of interviews with CEOs that we talked with. Not to mention help us sort through the responses to the current climate, which is just changing so rapidly. So as Ellen noted, we shared our overall findings from this year-long endeavor in our webinar 2 weeks ago. And then last week, we shared findings on what we learned about community foundations leaning in on racial equity. Those webinars were recorded, and you can access them on our website in the overview page, as Melody mentioned. So as we highlighted in our first 2 webinars, the most significant finding from our survey is that an eye-popping 98% of respondents plan to increase their community leadership activity in the next few years. Now note, this is from a survey issued by Candid that has community foundations from all sizes, from all across the country. And Candid reminds us that this is very representative of the community foundation field. But what we're really seeing is folks going all in. We are finding community foundations eager to take on and deepen their roles beyond grant making that will help community foundations be more effective partners in building equitable, inclusive, and more widely prosperous communities. Now, I want to note that the survey was taken before the pandemic, and many of you, all of you, have stepped up in response to this public health and economic crisis. And not only have community foundations raised nearly $1 billion and distributed much of that, many community foundations have been doing a lot more. And in our conversations with you over the past few months, we're hearing that you're working closely with your partners to continue to identify critical needs with your ears to the ground. You are informing public decision-making and addressing those systemic inequities that the pandemic has exposed and that we're hearing even more about in the recent protests for more racial equity and equality. So our research identified 3 interconnected areas of community leadership momentum among community foundations. First, we're seeing community foundations insisting on racial equity. We are seeing community foundations, many, with having a growing commitment to do their part to remedy the injustices caused by what we now know is structural racism, and recognizing the need to make an institutional commitment to this work. The second area of momentum we identified in our research was this notion of amplifying resident voice. Community foundations are seeing a role for themselves in ensuring an engaged and informed citizenry, which we all know is vital to a healthy democracy. And we'll talk more about this because that is obviously the focus of this particular webinar. But the third area of momentum that we uncovered is influencing public policy and systems. Because government policies and programs affect almost every aspect of our lives in pretty significant ways, community foundations are seeing that they'll have the greatest impact by helping to shape those policies and other big systems like employer practices. So these are the three areas of going all in that we identified through all this year-long of research. As I noted, the first webinar does give the overview, and now we're going to be going deeply in each of these three areas in our subsequent webinars. So today we're going to focus on amplifying community voice. So the US Constitution was established with the belief in a more perfect union, which is essentially asserting that we all have a responsibility to ensure that this country is living up to its strongest democratic ideals. Now, interestingly, community foundations were formed 100 years ago as a more democratic form of philanthropy. So this is sort of baked into community foundation DNA. And we all recognize the important role community foundations have in supporting the active exchange of ideas and in supporting participation by people from all walks of life. Now, this is particularly important now, and we now, especially when we know that 59% of Americans are not satisfied with the way democracy is working in the United States. And I want to recognize that this number is from February. So this is before COVID and before the protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd. So this is a pretty significant number. And we all know that there's significant lack of trust in government and major institutions, including institutions such as the news media, which are at, in many cases, record lows. But the first way in which community foundations are amplifying community voice is by convening community conversations. And so this ability to bring people together to learn about issues and share perspectives is really core to what community foundations do. And not surprisingly then, many community foundations plan to do more of this. And so when we ask community foundation leaders about their plans for future staff allocation, so we were very specific, are you going to be putting more staff to this, less, et cetera? It was clear that community foundations are putting together, are planning to continue serving in this role as community conveners. So you can see here, 76% plan to have convenings around issues. And there are many examples of this. So one is On the Table, which many of you have adopted, but was pioneered by the Chicago Community Trust. And this is an approach to civic dialogue and engagement that brings people together generally on a single day, generally around a meal, in church basements, libraries, restaurants, many other locales, to discuss the key issues facing communities today. And we'll hear a little bit more about that from Pedro Ramos about how the Philadelphia Foundation approached their version of On the Table. As part of that convening role, we're actually seeing community foundations recognizing the importance of offering space and places for community connection and conversation. So you'll see the Collaboratory at the Community Foundation of Southwest Florida, which has numerous spaces to come together and develop collective solutions. The Center for Philanthropy at the Foundation for the Carolinas, and there's many more. But I think one of my favorite comments is from Jerry Roll, who's at the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky, when she once said that the best thing she ever did in her office was take down a wall and put out a fruit bowl. So really just recognizing that conversation is so critical. Now, of course, we're also seeing modern day convening, podcasts, which of course is particularly relevant right now as all of us are working from home. And in conversations with Chanda, who's at the Minneapolis Foundation, I think is a great example of how that has working and has been really very popular there. So another way community foundations are amplifying community voice is by elevating resident voice and power. So people most affected by local decisions have often been left out of the discussion. But research shows that including residents in public decision-making builds trust with the public and improves outcomes. So for example, a study of state transportation departments found that increased community voice led to a dramatically improved quality of service in terms of the effectiveness and efficiency. So a number of community foundations are doing things to ensure that those voices are heard, and that people are actually supported in their desires to kind of band together for more power. But while there is a significant recognition of the importance of this work, I would say it's still an emergent one. So you can see from this table here on the far right, only 18% of respondents said their relationships with emerging community leaders was excellent. Now, community foundations do feel strongly about their relationship with donors and maybe other local foundations. But you can see once we get beyond that, there's a lot less comfort. We will hear, though, from our speakers quite a bit about this because they have been quite involved in really hearing from residents and giving them voice. The other thing community foundations are doing is amplifying community voice by investing in local journalism. They are supporting local journalism in creative ways, and of course it's in response to the local current realities. More than a quarter of the country's newspapers have vanished in the last 15 years, and about half of all local journalism jobs have disappeared. So we're really lucky to be able to hear from the Philadelphia Foundation on this because they fully recognize the importance of local press, and perhaps that's appropriate in the birthplace of American democracy. But finally, we're also seeing community foundations fueling democracy in other ways. Surveys showed that CEOs, community foundation CEOs, are seeing a real erosion in faith in our democratic system. So if you see here, 92% of survey respondents said public faith in our democratic systems has eroded, which is pretty significant. And so we are seeing community foundations do things like support the full census count, support voter registration drives, and the like. So from Silicon Valley to Pittsburgh to rural Alabama to Albuquerque, have all invested time and resources, for example, to get the count out. So, I've highlighted a number of examples here from community foundations, again, of all sizes from all across the country. But we have dozens more examples in our web portal. And I'll try to give you a little sense of that here, but this resource provides additional research findings. It has resources and key organizations you can consult, and then questions to consider along your journey. So what you can see up here is we've got an overview, and then we've got sections on each of these three areas of momentum. So I'll move down here. And you can see we've got a whole section on why this matters, which can give you additional information there. And then what we're finding in each of these areas I just mentioned. And so a lot of the data that I just shared with you is on the portal. You can see it here, along with, as I said, dozens and dozens of examples. And then in addition to that, we have a whole section about what you can do. And we have references to other institutions, other philanthropy serving organizations that could help you, and then also questions you can consider along the way. But importantly here, we also have a survey that we would love for you to take. We need to hear from you what kind of things would be helpful to you as you move along in your journey. So please, please take this survey so that we can be creating the kinds of learning opportunities that are best suited for your needs. So as again, you can see the key organizations, the key resources, and the questions to consider along your journey. So thank you for that, Melody. So now I'd like to turn to our speakers, who are three of our project advisory committee members. for a bit of conversation about their work. I want to note that our project director, Jim Rooney, and our director of communications, Melody McLean, will be answering questions in the chat box. And if possible, we'll answer questions in the Q&A box. And time permitting, we'll do our best to capture some of your questions for the presenters. But again, feel free to use the chat liberally so that you can even communicate with each other. So first, some very short introductions. Shelley O'Quinn joined Innovia Foundation as CEO in 2017. She is a former Spokane County Commissioner, and she represented the county's interest on 20 regional and statewide boards and commissions, so brings that really unique perspective. She's also been the Director of Education and Workforce Development for Greater Spokane Incorporated, and she's worked at the George Nethercutt Foundation and Habitat for Humanity. Ivy Allen has served as the president for the Mid-South since 2006. And Ivy's prior work experience is varied as well and includes serving as the Chief Operating Officer for MDC, Inc. And she was Director of Fellowship Programs for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And before being in the nonprofit arena, she was in the for-profit arena and was in finance and marketing positions in a number of Fortune 100 corporations, and brings a PhD in social policy from Columbia to her work at the foundation. Pedro Ramos has served as president and CEO of the Philadelphia Foundation since 2015, and he earlier practiced law for 2 decades, as a partner in the Philadelphia-based firms, and has served at the highest level of appointed city government in Philly, including as city solicitor, managing director, and president of the Board of Education. He's also served as vice president and chief of staff to the president at his alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania. So he brings expertise from all different sectors. So welcome, everyone. Welcome from all your different time zones. Ivy, I think I'd like to start with you. The Foundation for the Mid-South covers quite a big area and convenes public and private sectors around social and economic opportunity in the Mississippi Delta. So what are some of the ways that you use to facilitate learning and sharing and bringing folks together around a big area like that?
Sure. We take several approaches. One obviously is having community meetings, and as you said, we cover a broad cross-section. And so covering the Delta primarily of those 3 areas. So it's lots of driving and lots of conversations. But we are very intentional in the communities about having a cross-section of voices at the table. We have local residents and the residents who live there. We may have business partners at the table. And we also often have the public sector at the table, whether it's local to representatives at the state level. But for us, we have to have all those various voices there to really be able to have the conversation and identify solutions. And you have different folks with different lenses who can sit and say, that will work, that will not work. But our vision and our work really requires having a cross-section of voices at the table.
So Ivy, how, you bring residents. How do you ensure that it is a real conversation, say with business or people in government? And as isn't just one group complaining against another or not really listening and interacting, what do you do to ensure that it's really something of a conversation?
First, we start with facilitators. And so we do always utilize facilitators to guide the discussion. And we may have conversations, in all honesty, prior to the conversation to sit and say, we understand this group has this issue or that issue, or they may even have concerns with their elected officials. But we use outside folks to sit and facilitate the conversation. We draft questions. We do, sometimes it's fair to say, may have small conversations with some key partners prior to the big convening. But we do utilize facilitators to bring in all the voices and perspectives and let folks be heard.
Right.
And we document that information for them.
And return it back, or how does that work?
Return it back.
Yeah.
And sometimes, depending on what it is, they may make decisions before the meetings are over, because you might have a ton of ideas, and we don't like to go out with a ton of ideas because everybody thinks theirs may be. So we try to prioritize. And so some people may walk away disappointed that theirs didn't make it. And it could be a voting method, or it could be talking through what's the feasibility to achieve it.
Right, right. Shelley, you, the Innovia Foundation, under your leadership, has established a different way of really kind of hearing from folks, what you call local leadership councils. And you're in Eastern Washington and North Idaho. So, you know, both Shelley and Ivy are in fairly rural places. But it's predicated on the notion that local leaders are best equipped to diagnose and solve their community problems. And last year, your staff spent 205 work days outside Spokane County. And I think you said you racked up more than 16,000 miles. I bet it's been a little different the past few months. But anyway, how are you engaging your constituents across urban, suburban, and rural areas so that you can really impact your community?
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, actually, to put into context, we do serve a very large region. Innovia Foundation serves 20 counties, 2 states, 40,000 square miles, and 1 million people. And that urban rural mix of those 1 million people, 750,000 live in 2 counties, and that's Spokane and Kootenai counties. And historically, our foundation has made all of our decisions from Spokane County, where our office is located, and where the majority of our donors and nonprofits are located. But we knew that in order to really live into our vision to create vibrant and sustainable communities where every person has the opportunity to thrive, we knew this had to change. And I am a firm believer that to know our communities, we must actually be in our communities, and we need to be present. And we also believe that the needs and opportunities in Republic, Washington differ from those in Grangeville, Idaho, which is 10 hours south, and that both of these rural communities have different priorities from the urban core of Spokane and Coeur d'Alene. And the last thing that we want to do is continue to swoop in from our White Ivory Tower in Spokane and tell local communities what their priorities should be and how they should address them. Because we do believe that residents and local leaders already know what their role is, and that it's our job to come alongside of them and lift up and support the work that they're doing in their communities. But as community foundation leaders, you know, how do we do that with the limited staff and the immense geographic region? So we actually turned and looked south to Oregon Community Foundation, and we borrowed and built upon their concept of leadership councils. And in January of this past year, we launched 10 local leadership councils made up of civic, business, nonprofit, community leaders, grassroots leaders, to inform our work and elevate the priorities of our regional communities. And then we brought all of these leadership councils together, over 200 members, to our first annual leadership summit that we had in the first weekend of March. And they came together around this vision of vibrant and sustainable communities. And it didn't matter whether they were urban or rural or suburban, but it was truly the strength of our differences that made us better. And then you all know COVID hit 2 weeks later, at least for us, we were one of the early shutdowns. And so that actually gave us the ability to live into the power of community through our leadership councils. And since April, we have distributed over $4 million in COVID grants throughout our region to the priorities identified by the community, not through a formal grant application process. And that's truly powerful. And I just want to give you an example of what that looked like. So we funded search and rescue teams in Ferry County to update 12 large signs that they had spread throughout the county that provided information on the shutdown and where resources are available, because they don't have Wi-Fi and broadband in Ferry County. And we didn't fully realize the extent that they didn't have that connectivity until COVID hit. And then in Garfield County, where they have access to broadband, their students didn't actually have Chromebooks. And we wouldn't have known that being here in Spokane, where every student goes home with a computer every year. And so we funded those students. And then here locally, we actually worked with organizations that we had never funded before. We funded the Ministerial Alliance and Slavic Church Coalition, and groups that were all, were organizations that were never even on our radar screen, but because of the community voice and because of the members of our leadership council, they lifted up those priorities. And so through this work, our leadership councils have really taken ownership of the role that Inovia Foundation can play in their communities. And they meet with and without us, and they're developing the strategic goals and partnerships so that we can actually come alongside them and fund what can have the greatest impact on their community.
Well, and I've heard other community foundations say, Shelley, that they are so grateful that they got this work started before COVID, because it can make them that much more effective in COVID. I mean, and you're just a living example of that, that you could immediately go in and have community members really identify what their needs are.
Yeah. And I would honestly say that the work that we've done in the last 6 months, that it's taken us from, it would have taken us 2 or 3 years to really build the relationships that we've built. But because we had the leadership councils in place, we've just been able to turn it around significantly. So there's true power in community and community voice.
Great, thank you. So Pedro, you were an organization, obviously, as I mentioned, that used On the Table to get more direct input from a really diverse swath of local residents. It wasn't just, you know, residents that are at the same tables and have titles after their names. But tell us a little bit about this and how the program enabled you to kind of get an early bead on emerging trends and kind of help inform your work.
Yeah, On the Table was really a terrific and well-timed opportunity for us. I was relatively new to the foundation and to the community foundation world. Our community foundation had pivoted to leadership and in the mindset and direction of CF Leads related organizations. So On the Table gave us, you know, an opportunity to really, one, go out directly to residents and to have a massive sort of listening opportunity. The way we organized it, the first thing we did was we organized it from the ground up to be inclusive. So it wasn't like we did a civic thing and then attached diversity and inclusion to it. We set out from the very beginning, from the first minute, to say, how will our full geography, our full demographics be represented commensurate with the populations that we serve in the 7 counties and all the neighborhoods in the city, which is the biggest piece of that. So I'd say the most important thing we did all from the very start was to make sure that we had an outreach strategy that was going to get to every part of the community. It's an effort that's led by residents. So what we fundamentally do is run a campaign that solicits volunteers. Very rarely with volunteers with titles. They're really motivated residents in the community who volunteer to host a meal or some kind of gathering, you know, for folks that understand the On the Table concept, and then lead discussions that topics of which are sort of organic to that table. We offer toolkits and we suggest topics for those. But in essence, you've had these hundreds of individuals that have taken upon themselves to gather folks from within, friends, neighbors, coworkers. I think it was about 80% said they met somebody who they had never met before. About 2/3 said that they had a conversation with somebody that they thought they would never have met before. In the second and third year, we added sort of a mini grant component to fuel the continuation of discussions. And some of those discussions sort of continued, some of them pivoted into other things. A critical part was also a survey of the participants. And that for us was also important in a number of ways. One, it was a check on our grant making and our priorities. It was a way for us to share with other grant makers what residents, at least very active residents from every neighborhood and community were thinking. It ended up shaping some of our policy thinking. Last year when we had our local primary, we actually had sort of this blended virtual in-person fair where
Right.
it was a year when lots of people were running for new people were running for city council. We actually had an opportunity to have questions that posed by participants and on the table answered by each of the candidates in a video posting in addition to sort of the personal forum. And it you know, it lets us do things like last year in the fall, start the conversation before there's an infrastructure for like the census, to start that conversation in the fall about here's something happening big next year. What at the grassroots level do we want organizations that are going to be working on the census to know now as we sort of look ahead? So for us, it was a great way to sort of build momentum, especially as we were pivoting into sort of the civic and community leadership space.
So Pedro, what has this meant for, and I'm interested in this from all of you, what this means in terms of the kind of staff you have. This is a different day at the office. This is not just coming in and processing grants. So who have you hired that's different? You know, how have you used your own time as a CEO and your own social capital in a different way? Just curious as to how you were able really to cultivate beyond the usual suspects.
So I'd say one theme I've heard already in multiple places is this idea of leadership councils or civic leadership councils for different things to use to amass that social capital. So we're on the table. We had sort of a steering group to be able to make sure that we were kind of reaching further. In terms of staffing, we hadn't done that type of work before. So we went to a diverse firm that several people in that steering committee knew from effective outreach into community. And then we had basically assigned people from our existing staff to on the inside to sort of project manage this process. So the first few years, and Knight was very supportive, but we also put in an enormous amount of our own, because we thought it was really critical to building a foundation for our own leadership work.
Great. Ivy, what kind of skills do you look for in ensuring that you have people who can help elevate resident voice?
Those that are sensitive to understanding and respecting residents' voice. But for us also, most of the time, we're not even living in the communities where we are serving, because we're serving the Delta area of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. So for us, we have to rely on local residents. We work a lot with municipal leaders. We work a lot with community residents. Those tend to be who are our leaders, local residents. But for much of the things we're trying to accomplish, we find it very important to include those municipal leaders, whether it's the mayors, the county councils, or whatever it may be, because at the end of the day, sometimes they can be partners with us in leveraging public dollars to carry out some of the things that our resources won't cover. And quite frankly, we don't have enough to address some of the issues that they would like. So we work very closely with mayors and councils, and in different places, they have different names or descriptors, but we do bring them into the fold. And when we start a project or an effort, we may start by having conversations with the mayor, city councils, county councils, whatever they may be, as well as having resident meetings. And because many of these communities are small, when we have a community meeting, you're going to have those representatives there anyway.
Right.
And so that enables them to hear what their constituents say, but they live there, so they know already. Yeah. And so we bring in professional people to sit and guide the conversation, document the conversation, but we do rely heavily on the residents' voices and perspectives, and look for them to also bring forth their resources. And that's not just about money, but it's many different things that come into play to make the effort successful.
Thank you. And Shelley, there was a question, how do you facilitate your councils, your leadership councils?
We actually, we've assigned our entire team to different leadership councils. And so it didn't matter whether you're a grants person or a development person, everyone on the team, including myself, has a leadership council assigned to them. And then they're the point person for that region on everything. And so if you're in the grant making role at the organization, and someone from that region has come, wants to talk about setting up a potential fund, our grants team can have that conversation. And then when it gets more detailed and they need to get in the specifics, they hand them over to the appropriate person. But actually, as I saw that question, and I was going to put a plug in for the CF Lead CEO Executive Leadership Group, because it was during that CEO cohort that we rewrote all the job descriptions, and we integrated our grants team and our development team. And you just can't continue to work in silos. I mean, our development team is so much better at what they do, having made grants. So everyone on our team, regardless of their role, is a grant maker, and everyone on our team, regardless of their role, is a donor, does donor services. And so it's that integration, and then also, honestly, connecting them to leadership councils that continues to reinforce that, that breaking down those barriers.
Yeah, and I think more and more community foundations are really recognizing that if we really are going to live our missions, right? We really are serious about community impact. It's going to take aligning all departments, just as you said, and you see many more sort of rewriting job descriptions so that there's much more overlap. And so each department, right, really understands what its role is. So thank you for that. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of it. I imagine Pedro and Ivy, you have that too. Pedro, I wanted to give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about the Lenfest Institute, which was designed to advance sustainable and quality local journalism in the digital age. So tell us how this came about and how it augments your foundation's wider efforts to serve your community.
Well, I appreciate what was said earlier in the meeting about, the birthplace of American democracy.
Right, Pedro, that's coming from me in Concord, Massachusetts. So I'm being, I think it's a competition there.
Because good things really do happen in Philadelphia, as they say. And good things happen in Philadelphia. T-shirts are flying off the racks today. Last couple of days. So, I mean, this was incredible story. As I mentioned earlier, I started August 2015. Part of the effort of coming here and what drew me here was our board's interest in really moving in the direction of CF Leads, moving towards community leadership work and civic engagement and resident voice. And that's sort of where we started. And then the question was, what plans do we make and where do we go from here? And then while we're making plans, things happen. That was August. In November, a drama was playing out in the public sphere here about the future control and viability of the Philadelphia Inquirer, a Metro paper. When its owner proposed donating the ownership, adding a large endowment, and creating an organization dedicated to independent local journalism in the digital age, because he believed very strongly that local news is vital to democracy, and that the local sphere needs a fourth estate as well.
Yeah.
And what emerged from there, at the beginning, it was like, how do we make all this happen in the way that ensures the independence of the paper, that provides enough opportunity to give it a fighting chance with a quick transformation. And most of the calls that I get from other community foundations are actually about the structure, which I won't get into here. But as you mentioned, as a former tax exempt lawyer, I would say that what we called a very elegant structure. It worked very nicely through an amazing sort of team effort. As we, and part of that rethinking then wasn't just sort of what substitutes for print advertising, but and how do you sort of make economic sense in the digital age, but how do you tap a very changing readership and very changing needs in the community. So it wasn't just sort of technology, digital media, but also skills for investigating, reporting, and engaging. And then the conspicuous additional obstacle, which was the extent to which the Inquirer didn't look or sound or experience the region as most people in the city in the region do, just demographically and otherwise. So, you know, as we often say in the foundation world, and that was the beginning of a journey. And it's been, and I think it's certainly the Institute, which is focused on local journalism, on sustainable local journalism nationally, with our market as a key part of that, has quickly sort of pushed the not just sort of engage diverse audiences, but looking at the internal operations of the paper, looking at sourcing, looking at pipeline for junior talent, pipeline for mid-management talent, pipeline for editors, all the way to the board, and becoming a funder facilitator, because we actually don't have ownership control, even though we have ownership because of the elegant structure, but we are a major funder, so that we really have packaged our funding and our partnership with the Inquirer in a way that is integrating our DEI values, aspirations, which are not just social, but we believe critical to the future viability of the newspaper. And at the same time, helping fund the ecosystem beyond the one newspaper, which means Black and Brown led news organizations that are local, and supporting organizations that focus on journalists of color, and really not just sort of within the organization, but within the ecosystem, being a partner, being an investor, and being willing to sort of express a point of view in that work too.
Right. So Pedro, how much of this is something that another community foundation can duplicate after seeing kind of what you've done? Is this a model that can work other places, do you think?
I think this was designed around a specific set of circumstances. So, you know, I think a lot of the tools and a lot of the learning is very exportable. I mean, the idea here was that anything that we do should be replicable, and should be shareable. So I think, and the learning's been fast. I mean, we were very fortunate to start with very generous gifts and cash endowment to really get this going. So we've been able to learn a lot quickly, and help fuel some of that transformation, figure out what some things work and some things didn't work along the way. So we're, you know, I'm happy to talk to colleagues, also put them in touch with people on the ground now as this organization matured, that are doing the work day to day, as well as people at the newspaper.
Great, thank you. Shelley, you've been a big proponent of solution-based journalism, which of course is gaining popularity among community foundations in west of the Mississippi, places like Denver and Wichita and where you are. So what particularly appeals to you about this new form of journalism?
First, I'm going to say I think Pedro needs to have a whole webinar.
I think so.
On, the work that you've done around your local newspaper. So here in Spokane, we have one of the few family-owned newspapers left in the country, and it's a difficult industry. So we are fortunate to have had a really great relationship with them. I am a huge advocate for solutions-based journalism because so often, the media has a negative reputation, right? And investigative journalism has a role. It's important. They bring voice to important issues in our region, but I also believe that the newspaper can play, and journalism can play a role in providing solutions and doing research on what has worked. And so I know that the Seattle Foundation has a great partnership, and they've done both. And so here locally, we actually partnered with our local newspaper, and we funded a rural health reporter. And we asked them, we didn't tell them what to write. We asked them to write different types of stories. We said, bring awareness to the issues, talk about what's going on, but then also propose some solutions. tell us what's working around the country and around the world that could actually be possible solutions for the issues that you have raised through this work. And so we're on our second year of that. We are just launching a new co-funded reporter around racial equity. And we're going to be funding a racial equity reporter, and at the same time, we're launching a racial equity fund and inviting the community to actually be part of the solution around, how can we address this really difficult issue in our region. And then finally, we've partnered with our local newspaper around a book club. It's called Northwest Passages. And so we bring in authors and who, we put out the book for the community, we bring in authors to then talk about the book, and we pick controversial topics. And it can be, I say controversial, but think local, right? So for us, wolves, that's a controversial topic. You have farmers and you have, ranchers that want to get rid of the wolf population that's come back. And then you have those that want to protect. Well, what a great way to have a conversation by bringing an author in, and you can have a conversation around a really difficult topic. That event had over 200 people, and it was our very first event. And since then, especially with COVID and going online, we have upwards of 600-700 people that join our book clubs. And we've touched on everything from immigration to poverty, education. It's been a really just fantastic way to partner with the newspaper and with our local partners to have tough local conversations around important issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So we did have another question from one of our participants. Recognizing that all of this stuff is very intertwined, all of these strategies are very intertwined. Right now we're talking about resident engagement, community voice, but how have you kind of prioritized various strategies? So Shelley, I know you've gone all of you've gone pretty full speed ahead, but in the short time you've been there, have you prioritized? Have you tried to do all at once? How'd you get started?
We actually started when I first joined the foundation 3.5 years ago with on a journey to discover our why. We were a very traditional community foundation, and we did a lot of grant making, and we did donor relationships, and we were very transactional, right? Dollars in, dollars out. But I don't know about all of you, but I have no desire to, I don't really care how much money we have or how many funds we have or how many grants we give out. If at the end of the day, we're not transforming the lives and communities we serve, then why are we doing it? And so for us as an organization, we had to discover our why. And so we went on a journey with our staff, our board, our stakeholders, our donors, our nonprofits, and discovered our why. Actually, we ended up rewriting our mission and vision statements and our core values, and lifted up that, our role as a community foundation truly is about transforming the lives and communities in our region. And then we took that and we said, okay, well, how do we live that out in our community? And so we went back to our community again, and we had conversations and we did multiple surveys. So we communicated in multiple ways. We held in-person meetings when we could, right? Community meetings, we did surveys, we worked with board and staff. We provide feedback of what does vibrant, sustainable communities mean for your community, right? And what does this look like for you? And then we took all of that information, we took all of our learning from all of you, as we interviewed over 25 community foundations around the country. We took a look at what we thought were the most innovative and doing great things. And then, so we took a look at the field and what they were doing, and we brought them together. And then we created our 3 priorities over the next 5 years. And that's, it actually just happens to touch nicely on this report. Just maybe that's been a little bit influenced by we took our entire board and team through the community leadership model, which I've lived as a commissioner, as an elected official, but we took our team through that. And so it's been a 3-year process to get to where we are. We did not identify our priorities overnight. It really has been an informed process.
And Ivy, you had a very deliberate formation as well, right? About, yes. I think around racial equity, right?
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about how you did that and sort of prioritize where you're headed.
We, a lot like what the others do, which is we have those community conversations, and we are intentional about a cross-section of voices there. And what we do as the foundation, we do not lead the discussion. We always hire facilitators to set and facilitate the discussion, create the maps and everything that's required. So we're not viewed as telling the group what's gonna happen. And so for us, we do pretty much the same as everybody else. We have those conversations, we have dialogues, and we've even had racial sensitivity training. It depends upon what's required to get them at the table and forget about what you did to my family 2 generations ago. And we do have to address that sometime, not us personally, but get to that aspect of it. But we rely on professional facilitators to really have the conversations, guide the conversations. We're always there. We have questions and things that we want to have, but to not look as if we are partial. We're not the ones at front. We are there, but we're using professionals to guide the discussions. And I will be honest, we may have dialogue, you know, post, because we don't solve this in one meeting. And so what we pick up the next time, they may have directions from us as to go deeper here, or we've heard enough of that piece of it. But we also want to make sure everybody feels engaged. And so for us, we use facilitators to guide that discussion. And then we go through the hard parts of what is it. Sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's about a long-standing rivalry that has nothing to do with cost, but you did something to my family, you know, a while ago. And so we have to be respectful of that. And we do try, we don't try to solve it there, but give folks the space. But then may work outside of the group to try to bring some resolution so that doesn't, because that can also derail a group project if every time you assemble, people are rehashing old things. And so we are always there, but we often use facilitators to really guide the discussion. And I'll be honest, we do say this is our yes or no, although we may not say that out loud, but we do try to guide the conversation. Because as I said, we don't necessarily live there. And as Shelley would know, when you're working with all these various communities, some of this stuff is multi-family, multi-generational. But how do we get to something that everybody's agreed on? And that's the North Star that we're after. And that's what we keep them focused on. We can listen and hear the complaints, but at the end of the day, we really try to focus on that North Star. And that's why we also often try to make sure that those municipal leaders are sitting there as well, because it's also sometimes what resources do you have and what can you offer up in that process.
But that real focus of being of, by, and for the community foundation, which you're being part of. Pedro, in the minute we have left, people might be interested in some of the work that you're doing around census. So whet our appetite a little bit. And again, many community foundations across the country have been doing some census work, but just as an example of the kind of work you can kind of do to support democratic institutions, give us a thumbnail if you would.
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate that at least the immediate counties here really scaled up census work very well and with community-based organizations. So, you know, we were helpful in the very beginning when PA Voice was trying to set up in Pennsylvania to sort of get the startup capital there. We were helpful through on the table, getting the conversation again going, discussions. And then what we've, I think, done is what we do best, which is to support our community-based organizations in their work. So it's been sort of being available to the government-led efforts and being available to community-based organizations, not just as they've sort of incorporated into their work, which they're very informed about, but also being available as an agile partner as through the year.
And building on those relationships. That's great. Thank you. Well, thanks to the three of you. We could talk to you for hours and hours, but you can find out more about all these organizations on our website if you go through this section. And then, as we pointed out, dozens and dozens of other community foundations are doing this kind of work. So we do want to remind you to check out the portal, cfleads.org, going all in. And then please do take our survey and then join us for the last in our webinar survey series, which will be October 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And we'll hear from Paul Grogan at the Boston Foundation, Dick Ober from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, Steve Selesno at the Arizona Community Foundation, and then Ashley Swearingen from the Central Valley Community Foundation in Fresno, California. So thanks again, everyone. We really appreciate the role of our speakers here today, both speaking and as great participants in the advisory committee. But thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.